The game had barely ended. The stadium lights were still full. The grounds crew hadn't touched the infield dirt. The reporters were still making their way through the corridors toward the press conference area, recorders in hand, questions half-formed in their heads. The final out was still fresh enough that you could feel it in the building, that particular heaviness that settles over a home stadium after a loss that mattered. And inside the Dodgers front office, something had already been decided. Not discussed. Not proposed. Not floated as a possibility to be examined over the coming days with the careful deliberation that roster decisions of this magnitude normally require. Decided. 2 veteran players. Gone. Released. Their time in Dodger blue ended not with a quiet conversation at the close of a season or a mutual agreement negotiated over weeks, but in the compressed, pressurized minutes immediately following a defeat that had apparently been the final entry in a ledger that the front office had been keeping for longer than anyone on the field realized. The announcement came fast. Too fast, as it turned out, for the one person in the organization whose voice should have been part of the conversation before any announcement was made. Dave Roberts found out the way managers should never find out about decisions affecting their roster. After the fact. And the words he used when he realized what had happened, words that leaked from behind closed doors into the ears of reporters who know how to listen at the right moments, became the second story of a night that had already produced more than enough drama for one evening. "Why didn't you consult me?" 4 words. Spoken in fury. And they cracked the carefully maintained image of organizational unity that the Dodgers present to the public with the precision of a team that understands how much perception matters in this market, in this city, under this level of scrutiny. To understand how a night like this happens, you have to understand the pressure that accumulates inside a franchise that operates at the level the Dodgers operate at every single season. This is not a team that rebuilds. This is not a team that accepts transitional years or developmental growing pains with philosophical patience. This is an organization that expects to win, is built to win, is funded to win, and measures every decision against the singular standard of whether it moves the needle toward October. When a loss lands in that environment, especially a loss that carries the particular sting of one that felt preventable, that felt like an organizational problem as much as an on-field problem, the response from the front office is not always measured by the same clock that the coaching staff uses. Managers process losses over hours. They review, they adjust, they sleep on it, they come back the next day with a recalibrated plan. Front offices sometimes process losses in minutes. And on this night, the Dodgers front office processed this one in approximately the amount of time it takes to have a brief, decisive conversation between people who had already been moving toward a conclusion before the final out was recorded. The 2 veteran players whose releases were announced were not surprises to the people inside the building who pay closest attention to these things. Their situations had been the subject of internal conversation for some time. Performance concerns. Fit concerns. Questions about whether their presence in the clubhouse was producing the kind of return that justified the roster space on a team with championship expectations. But knowing that a decision is coming and having that decision arrive without warning, announced publicly before the manager has been informed, are 2 entirely different experiences. Roberts experienced the second one. The details of exactly what happened in the corridor outside the clubhouse in the minutes after the loss became the subject of intense reporting by every outlet with a source inside the organization. Accounts vary slightly in their specifics, that is always the case when something volatile happens in a space where not everyone present is a neutral observer. But the core of what occurred is consistent across enough credible reporting to be treated as established. Roberts learned about the releases. He understood immediately that the timeline of the announcement meant he had not been part of the process that produced it. And the reaction that followed was not the quiet, private frustration of a man who has learned to absorb organizational decisions with professional equanimity. It was anger. Real, visible, audible anger. The quote that spread through the reporting, "Why didn't you consult me?" carries more weight than 4 words normally carry because of everything packed behind them. It is not simply a complaint about process. It is a challenge to the fundamental structure of how decisions get made inside a baseball organization. It is a manager asserting, at full volume in the immediate aftermath of a loss, that the people who handle the roster cannot operate as a separate government from the people who manage the clubhouse. That tension, between front office authority and managerial autonomy, is not unique to the Dodgers. It exists in every organization in professional baseball to varying degrees. But it is rarely exposed this publicly, this quickly, and with this much heat. The reporters who caught wind of it understood immediately that they had something beyond a roster transaction story. They had a window into the internal dynamics of the most watched franchise in the sport. And they reported it accordingly. The clubhouse in the hours after a loss of this kind is not a comfortable place under normal circumstances. Players process differently, some loudly, some in absolute silence, some by immediately turning their focus to the mechanics of what went wrong and how to correct it. The staff moves carefully through those hours, reading the room, knowing when to speak and when to simply be present without demanding anything. On this night, the room had something extra in it that made everything more complicated. Word moves fast in a major league clubhouse. Faster than front offices sometimes account for when they make decisions in the compressed timeline immediately following a game. Players talk. They check their phones. They read the same alerts that the rest of the baseball world is reading within minutes of any announcement. The two veterans whose releases had been announced were still in that building when the news became public knowledge. That detail, that the timing had placed them in the position of learning about or confirming their own releases in real time, surrounded by teammates who were simultaneously processing a loss, is the detail that made reporters who cover this team shake their heads as they wrote their stories. It added a layer of human weight to what was already a complicated night. And through all of it, through the announcement, through Robert's fury leaking into the corridors, through the clubhouse absorbing the news in real time, one figure in the room was being watched more closely than any other. Shohei Ohtani. There is something that veteran clubhouse reporters have observed about Ohtani in moments of organizational turbulence. It has been noted quietly, mentioned in profiles, referenced in conversations between people who spend enough time around the team to see past the game day performance into the daily texture of how the franchise functions. He does not absorb chaos. He does not amplify it. He does not perform neutrality in the self-conscious way of someone who has been media trained to appear calm in difficult moments. He simply is calm. On this night, in a clubhouse that had every reason to feel fractured, the loss still fresh, two veterans suddenly gone, the manager's fury a presence that everyone could feel even if they hadn't heard the exact words, Ohtani moved through the space with a steadiness that reporters present described afterward with a consistency that made it impossible to dismiss as spin. He spoke to people. Not about the releases, not about Roberts, not about the front office decision that was consuming every other conversation in the building. He spoke to people the way someone speaks when they understand that the most useful thing they can offer in a volatile moment is not commentary but presence. His face carried none of the visible strain that marked nearly everyone else in the room. His body language held none of the tension. He was not performing composure for the cameras that would eventually find their way into the space. He was simply there, and the way he was there seemed to matter to the people around him in ways that don't translate easily into a transcript. One reporter who has covered the team for several seasons described it afterward as the calmest he had ever seen a single player be in a clubhouse moment of this magnitude. Not detached calm. Not the cold indifference of someone who has walled himself off from what is happening around him. Present calm. The kind that comes from someone who has decided, at some point before the crisis arrived, how they are going to carry themselves when everything around them is moving too fast. The morning after arrived with the Dodgers organization facing questions they were not fully prepared to answer publicly. The two roster moves were confirmed. The reporting around Roberts' reaction had solidified into something that demanded a response. The narrative of a franchise fracturing under post-loss pressure was running at full speed across every platform that covers the sport. Interviews were requested. Statements were prepared. The machinery of damage control began its careful work. But the image that stayed with the reporters who had been inside that building on the night it all happened, the image that kept returning in their conversations with each other the following morning, was not Robert's fury. It was not the GM's announcement. It was not the two veterans whose careers in Los Angeles had ended in the worst possible way. It was Ohtani. Standing in the middle of a clubhouse that was coming apart at several seams simultaneously. Completely still. Not because nothing was happening around him. But because he had already decided that whatever was happening around him was not going to happen inside him. That is a kind of strength that the scoreboard doesn't measure. And on a night when the Dodgers produced very little of it anywhere else in the building, it was the thing that people who were there could not stop talking about.